The image we all have of the French Revolution is a picture of starving peasants. We imagine men and women with hollow eyes holding pitchforks, screaming for bread. We imagine the cobblestones of Paris stained with blood, and the sharp blade of the guillotine falling again and again. We are taught in school that the French Revolution was a class war. We are told it was a battle between the poor and the rich, between the downtrodden masses and the arrogant aristocracy who told them to eat cake. And while the hunger was real and the anger was justified, there is a deeper, colder truth hidden beneath the chaos. The French Revolution did not begin with a shout in the streets. It began with a whisper in a counting house. It did not start because the king ran out of bread. It started because the king ran out of credit. The collapse of the French monarchy was not a moral failure. It was a mathematical inevitability caused by a mountain of debt. And the irony that haunts this story is where that debt came from. It did not come from building palaces or buying diamonds. The debt that destroyed the King of France was acquired to buy freedom for the United States of America. This is the story of how the birth of one republic caused the death of a monarchy. This is the story of how a loan portfolio became a death warrant. To understand the financial suicide of King Louis XVI, we have to go back to a time before the Revolution, to the year 1774. When Louis ascended to the throne, he was a young man of 20 years old. He was not the tyrant of revolutionary propaganda. He was a shy, quiet man who enjoyed locksmithing and hunting. He wanted to be loved by his people, but he inherited a poisoned chalice. The French state was already teetering on the edge of financial ruin. His grandfather, King Louis XV, had spent lavishly on wars and mistresses, leaving the treasury bare. But the real problem was not the spending. It was the revenue. France was the richest country in Europe, but the French government was poor. This was because the tax system was fundamentally broken. The nobility and the clergy, who owned most of the land and held most of the wealth, were largely exempt from paying taxes. The burden fell almost entirely on the peasants and the rising middle class. It was a system designed for a feudal world that no longer existed. But young Louis might have survived this inequality if not for his burning desire for revenge. To the French ruling class, the year 1763 was a scar on their soul. That was the year they lost the 7 Years' War to their archenemy, Great Britain. France had been humiliated. They had lost Canada. They had lost influence in India. They had been stripped of their status as the dominant global superpower. For the advisors surrounding the king, particularly the foreign minister, the Quai de Veine, the only goal of French foreign policy was to humble the British. They waited and watched for an opportunity to strike back. That opportunity arrived in 1776. Across the Atlantic Ocean, the British colonies in America declared their independence. To the French court, these American rebels were a godsend. They were creating a distraction that would drain British resources and weaken the British Navy. At first, France sent secret aid. They sent gunpowder and rifles through shell companies and back channels. But after the Americans won the Battle of Saratoga in 1777, the French saw a chance to deal a mortal blow to Britain. They decided to openly ally with the United States. This was the moment the French monarchy signed its own death warrant. The king's advisors told him that the war would be quick and cheap. They were wrong on both counts. Naval warfare in the 18th century was the most expensive human endeavor on Earth. Building a ship of the line, which carried 74 cannons, required 2,000 oak trees and miles of rope. It required a massive industrial infrastructure. And once the ships were built, they had to be manned and provisioned for months at sea. When France declared war on Britain in 1778, they were committing to a global conflict that would stretch from the Chesapeake Bay to the coast of India. The man in charge of paying for this global war was Jacques Neer. Necker was a Swiss banker who had been appointed as the Director General of Finance. He was a Protestant and a foreigner, which meant he could not hold the official title of minister, but he held the power. Neer was a wizard of public relations. He knew that the French people were already taxed to the limit, i.e., he knew that if he raised taxes to pay for the American war, there would be unrest. So he decided to fund the war entirely through borrowing. He argued that the war was an investment that would pay off when Britain was defeated and French trade expanded. Necker turned to the bankers of Europe. He sold annuities, which were financial products where an investor paid a lump sum up front, and the government promised to pay them a yearly income for the rest of their life. Necker offered generous interest rates to attract capital. Money flooded into the French treasury from Geneva, from Amsterdam, and from London itself. The French public loved Necker because he fought a war without raising their taxes. They saw him as a financial genius who could create money out of thin air. In 1781, Necker published a famous document called the Compte Rendu au Roi. It was the first time the French budget had ever been made public. In this document, Necker claimed that the French budget was in a surplus of 10 million livres. It was a masterpiece of creative accounting. He had left out the massive, extraordinary expenses of the war and only showed the ordinary operating costs. The public believed him. The bankers believed him. They kept lending. But the reality was a hemorrhage of gold. The French fleet under Admiral de Grasse sailed to America. In 1781, they blockaded the Chesapeake Bay, preventing the British Navy from rescuing General Cornwallis at Yorktown. This naval blockade was the decisive factor in the American victory. George Washington could not have won at Yorktown without the French Navy. The United States of America owes its existence to the ships paid for by King Louis XVI, but the cost of that fleet was astronomical. By the time the Treaty of Paris was signed in 1783, ending the war, France had spent over 1.3 billion livres on the American Revolution. To put that number in perspective, it was enough money to feed and house 7 million French peasants for a year. It was twice the annual revenue of the French state. The war ended, and the Americans celebrated their freedom. They wrote their constitution and began building their republic. But in Versailles, the party was over, and the bill was due. The loans that Necker had taken out began to mature. The interest payments started to pile up. Necker had been fired in 1781, but his successors were left to deal with the mess. They found that the treasury was empty. The surplus that Necker had claimed was a fantasy. By 1786, the situation had become critical. The new Comptroller General of Finance was Charles Alexander de Calonne. Calonne was a charming and intelligent man who realized that the game was up. He sat down and audited the books. What he found terrified him. The French state was running a deficit of 112 million livres a year. But the most terrifying statistic was the debt service. Nearly half of the entire annual revenue of France was going just to pay the interest on the debt. Not to pay down the principal, just to pay the interest. The other half had to pay for the army, the navy, the royal court, and the public works. There was no money left. The state was functionally bankrupt. Calonne knew that he could not borrow any more money. The bankers had realized that France was a bad risk. The interest rates they demanded were becoming extortionate. He also knew he could not tax the peasants anymore. They were already starving. The only solution was to tax the rich. Calonne proposed a radical reform. He wanted to introduce a universal land tax that everyone, including the nobility and the clergy, would have to pay. It was a revolutionary idea that struck at the heart of the feudal system. But Calonne knew that the Parle, which were the high courts of France, would never register such a law. The Parle were controlled by the nobility, and they fiercely defended their tax exemptions. So Calonne convinced the king to call an assembly of notables. This was a gathering of the most powerful men in the kingdom, princes, dukes, bishops, and magistrates. Calonne believed that if he explained the dire situation to them man to man, they would put their patriotism above their privileges and agree to the tax. The Assembly of Notables met in Versailles in February 1787. It was a disaster. Calonne stood before them and revealed the true state of the finances. He told them about the deficit. He told them about the crushing weight of the American war debt. He expected them to be shocked into action. Instead, they were furious. They had believed Necker's lie that the budget was in surplus. They accused Calonne of corruption and incompetence. They asked where the money had gone. They refused to give up their tax exemptions. They argued that they were the defenders of the people against the tyranny of the king, while in reality, they were defending their own wallets. The king tried to support Calonne, but the political pressure was too great. The nobility launched a vicious propaganda campaign against the minister. They called him Monsieur Deficit. Louis, who was always indecisive, eventually caved. He fired Calonne and exiled him to his country estate. It was a fatal mistake. By firing the one man who had a plan to save the monarchy, Louis showed that he was weak. He showed that he could be bullied by the aristocracy. The king appointed a new minister, Etienne Charles de Lemaigne de Brienne, who was an archbishop. Brienne had been one of Connemass's loudest critics, but when he looked at the books, he realized that Cog was right. There was no other way. Brienne tried to pass the same land tax reforms. Again, the parliaments refused. The conflict between the king and the nobility escalated. The king tried to force the laws through by royal decree. The parlance declared the decrees illegal. The king exiled the Parliament of Paris to the city of Troyes. The people of Paris, who did not understand that the parliament was fighting to keep its own tax breaks, supported the nobility. They rioted in the streets, shouting support for the parliament and hatred for the king's ministers. It was a total political deadlock. The government was paralyzed. The loans were coming due. And then nature intervened. The years 1787 and 1788 saw terrible weather. Heavy rains were followed by a severe drought. Then came a winter of extreme cold. The hailstorms destroyed the wheat harvest. The price of bread began to skyrocket. An average French worker spent 50% of his income on bread in normal times. By 1789, he was spending 88%. Hunger began to stalk the land. But even as the people starved, the central crisis remained the debt. The king had no money to buy grain to subsidize the bread prices. He had no money to pay the soldiers to keep order. In a final desperate act, Brienne suspended all payments from the royal treasury. It was a partial default. The credit of France collapsed completely. No one would lend the king a single livre. Cornered and desperate, Louis XVI made the decision that would end his life. He announced that he would call the Estates General. The Estates General was the closest thing France had to a parliament, but it had not met since the year 1614. It was an assembly of the three estates of the realm. The first estate was the clergy, the second estate was the nobility, and the third estate was everyone else, the lawyers, the merchants, the peasants, the people. The king hoped that the Estates General would approve new taxes that the parliament had blocked. He hoped that by appealing to the nation, he could bypass the stubborn aristocracy. He did not realize that he was opening Pandora's box. The election of the representatives to the Estates General unleashed a wave of political debate that had never been seen in France. In every village and town, people gathered to write lists of grievances called cahiers de doléances. They wrote about the unfair taxes. They wrote about the corruption of the church. They wrote about the high price of bread. But underneath it all was the realization that the system was broken. The elections were held in the spring of 1789. The Third Estate, which represented 98% of the population, was angry and energized. They were inspired by the ideas of the Enlightenment and, ironically, by the example of the American Revolution. They looked across the ocean and saw a nation that governed itself without a king and without an aristocracy. Many of the French officers who had fought in America, like the Marquis de Lafayette, came home with heads full of liberty and equality. They told stories of George Washington and the Continental Congress. They spread the virus of democracy in the salons of Paris. The irony was palpable. The king had sent these men to America to hurt the British, but they had returned to hurt him. He had spent his treasury to build a republic abroad, and now that republic was serving as the model for his own destruction. The American debt had bankrupted his state, and the American ideal was delegitimizing his rule. On May 5, 1789, the Estates General opened at Versailles. It was a grand spectacle. The king sat on his throne in his velvet robes. The nobility wore their plumed hats and swords. The clergy wore their vestments. And the 600 deputies of the Third Estate wore simple black suits. From the very first moment, there was tension. The king gave a speech that was disappointing. He talked only about the finances. He treated the Estates General like a glorified focus group called to fix a budget problem. He did not talk about reform. He did not talk about a constitution. He did not understand that the people did not want to just pay his debts. They wanted a say in how the money was spent. The Third Estate refused to accept the old rules where each estate voted separately. They knew that if they voted by estate, the clergy and the nobility would always outvote them 2-1. They demanded that all three estates meet together and vote by head. This would give the Third Estate the advantage, as they had more deputies and they could count on support from the liberal nobles and the poor parish priests. The standoff lasted for weeks. The king vacillated. He was urged by his brothers and the queen, Marie Antoinette, to be firm and crush the upstarts. But he was also afraid of the growing anger in Paris. On June 17th, the Third Estate took a momentous step. They declared themselves to be the National Assembly. They claimed that they were the only true representatives of the French nation. It was an act of revolution. They were saying that sovereignty did not reside in the king, but in the people. 3 days later, on June 20th, they arrived at their meeting hall to find the doors locked. The king, his officials claimed, said it was for repairs, but the deputies believed the king was trying to dissolve the assembly. They marched to a nearby indoor tennis court. There, standing on the wooden floor with rain pouring outside, they swore a solemn oath. They swore that they would not separate until they had written a constitution for France. It was known as the tennis court oath. The king was furious, but he was also powerless. He ordered the nobility and the clergy to join the National Assembly. But at the same time, he began to gather troops around Paris and Versailles. He called in the foreign regiments, the Swiss and German mercenaries, who were considered more loyal than the French soldiers. The people of Paris watched the troop movements with growing alarm. They believed that the king was planning a massacre. They believed he was going to starve the city into submission. The price of bread was at its highest point in decades. Rumors swirled in the coffee shops of the Palais Royal. And then the king struck the match that would ignite the powder keg. On July 11th, He fired Jacques Necker. Necker had been recalled to office a year earlier as a last-ditch effort to save the finances. The people saw Necker as their only friend in the government. They believed he was the only one who could keep the price of bread down. When the news of his dismissal reached Paris on July 12th, it was seen as the beginning of the counter-revolution. A young journalist named Camille Desmoulins leaped onto a table outside a café. He pulled a pistol from his coat and shouted to the crowd to arm themselves. He told them that the firing of Necker was the tolling of the bell for a St. Bartholomew's massacre of patriots. The city exploded. Crowds roamed the streets searching for weapons. They raided the gunsmiths. They burned the toll barriers that taxed food entering the city. On the morning of July 14th, a massive crowd gathered outside the Hôtel des Invalides, a military hospital where they seized thousands of muskets and cannons. But they had no gunpowder. They knew where the gunpowder was kept. It was stored in the basement of a medieval fortress on the east side of Paris, a fortress that had served as a royal prison for centuries, a symbol of the king's absolute power. The Bastille. The crowd marched to the Bastille. They did not go there to free the prisoners. There were only 7 prisoners inside, and most of them were forgers or madmen. They went there for the powder. They demanded that the governor of the Bastille, the Marquis de Launay, open the gates. He refused. He tried to negotiate, but the crowd was impatient and hungry. Someone cut the chains of the drawbridge. The crowd surged in. The soldiers on the ramparts opened fire. A battle raged for hours. 98 attackers were killed. But then, the French Guards, a regiment of professional soldiers, defected to the side of the crowd. They brought up cannons and aimed them at the gate. Delaunay realized it was hopeless. He surrendered. The crowd stormed the fortress. They dragged Delaunay into the street. He was beaten and stabbed and finally beheaded. His head was put on a pike and paraded through the streets of Paris. The king was asleep at Versailles when the news arrived. The Duc de la Rochefoucauld-Liancourt woke him up. The king asked, "Is it a revolt?" The Duke replied, "No, sire. It is a revolution." We end the first part of the story with the fall of the Bastille. The symbol of royal authority had been dismantled brick by brick. The king had lost control of his capital. But the financial crisis that had started it all was far from over. In fact, it was about to get much worse. The National Assembly had seized power, but they had also inherited the king's debts. The interest payments were still due. The soldiers still needed to be paid, and the people were still hungry. In the second part of this story, we will see how the revolution tried to solve the debt crisis with a disastrous experiment in paper money. We will see how the American debt continued to haunt the new republic. And we will follow the tragic path that led Louis XVI from the throne to the trial and finally to the scaffold, where he would pay the ultimate price for his investment in American liberty. The smoke from the Bastille had barely cleared when the National Assembly realized they had conquered a bankrupt nation. They had seized political power, but they had also inherited the financial ruin that had brought the monarchy to its knees. The king was now a prisoner of the revolution, living in the Tuileries Palace in Paris. But the debt remained. The 1.3 billion livres spent on the American Revolution was still on the books. The interest was still accumulating every minute of every day. The bankers of Europe did not care about the rights of man. They cared about their return on investment. The National Assembly was filled with lawyers and idealists who could write eloquent declarations about liberty and equality, but they had no idea how to run an economy. They had abolished the old tax system, which was unfair, but they had not yet built a new one to replace it. Tax revenue collapsed completely. The people, having thrown off the yoke of the king, simply stopped paying taxes. The deficit ballooned. The state was bleeding to death. In November 1789, the Assembly made a fateful decision. They looked around for a source of wealth to plug the hole in the budget, and their eyes fell upon the Catholic Church. The Church was the largest landowner in France, owning nearly 10% of all the land. It was a vast reservoir of wealth that had been accumulated over 1,000 years. The revolutionary leader Talleyrand, who was himself a bishop, proposed that the church lands be nationalized. He argued that the land belonged to the nation and should be used to pay the nation's debts. The Assembly passed the decree. They seized the church lands, effectively conducting the largest property theft in French history. But they couldn't just sell all the land at once. If they dumped millions of acres onto the market, real estate prices would crash. So they came up with a clever financial instrument. They issued paper certificates called assignats. These certificates were backed by the value of the seized church land. The idea was that the government would use these assignats to pay its debts. The creditors could then use the assignats to buy the church land at auction. Once the land was bought, the assignats would be destroyed. It seemed like a perfect solution, but the temptation of the printing press proved too strong. The government found that it was easy to print assignats to pay for daily expenses. They started printing more and more. They lost the discipline to burn them as the land was sold. The assignat mutated from a land bond into a paper currency. And like all fiat currencies printed without restraint, it began to lose value. Inflation took hold. The more paper money the government printed, the less it was worth. Prices for food and firewood skyrocketed. The peasants who had initially supported the revolution found that their paper money bought less bread than the king's old silver coins had. Meanwhile, the political situation was deteriorating. The king had accepted the constitution, but he was secretly plotting his escape. He hated the revolution, he hated the attacks on the church, and he hated being a puppet. In June 1791, he and his family tried to flee Paris in disguise, hoping to reach the Austrian border and rally an army to retake his throne. They were recognized in the town of Varennes and dragged back to Paris in humiliation. The flight to Varennes destroyed the last shreds of the people's love for the king. He was now seen as a traitor. But the final nail in the coffin was the war. In April 1792, France declared war on Austria and Prussia. The revolutionaries believed that a war would unite the people and spread the revolution to the rest of Europe. The king secretly supported the war because he believed that the French armies would be defeated and the foreign powers would restore him to the throne. It was a gamble where everyone was betting on chaos. The war went badly at first. The French armies were disorganized and undisciplined. The Prussian army marched toward Paris, threatening to burn the city to the ground if the king was harmed. This threat, known as the Brunswick Manifesto, had the opposite effect. It enraged the people of Paris. On August 10, 1792, a mob stormed the Tuileries Palace. The king's Swiss guards were massacred. Louis and his family fled to the National Assembly for protection, but the Assembly arrested them. The monarchy was abolished. The French Republic was born. Now the king was just a citizen. They called him Louis Capet, and they put him on trial for treason. The trial of Louis XV in December 1792 was a piece of political theater, but it was also a tragedy of irony. The charges against him listed 33 crimes. They accused him of conspiring with foreign powers. They accused him of massacring the people. But they did not accuse him of the one act that had actually made the revolution possible. No one mentioned the American debt. No one mentioned that he had bankrupted his own throne to fight for the liberty that his judges now claim to represent. In the convention, the radical Jacobins, led by Robespierre, argued that the king must die so that the nation could live. They argued that a king could not be judged like a normal man because his very existence was a crime against the republic. The moderates tried to save him, proposing imprisonment or exile, but the mood was bloodthirsty. The vote was taken by a narrow margin, and the king was sentenced to death. On the morning of January 21, 1793, Louis XVI was driven in a carriage to the Place de la Révolution. He tried to speak to the crowd, saying, "I die innocent of all the crimes laid to my charge. I pardon those who have occasioned my death." But the drums drowned out his voice. He was strapped to the plank. The blade fell. The executioner held up the severed head to the crowd, and a cry of "Vive la République" went up. But the death of the king did not solve the debt crisis. In fact, the war with the rest of Europe, which intensified after the execution, drained the treasury even faster. The government turned on the printing presses again. By 1795, inflation was so bad that people were starving in the streets with pockets full of money. A loaf of bread that cost 3 sous in 1790 cost 300 sous. The assignat became worthless trash. The financial chaos led to political chaos, which led to the Reign of Terror, and eventually to the rise of a dictator who would restore order at the point of a sword, Napoleon Bonaparte. And what of the American debt? The debt that had started the chain reaction? The United States watched the French Revolution with a mixture of hope and horror. When the French Republic was declared, they sent a new ambassador, Citizen Genet, to America. Genet demanded that the United States repay the war loans immediately. He argued that France was fighting for its life and needed the money. This placed George Washington in a terrible position. The United States was also broke. They were still struggling to organize their own finances under Alexander Hamilton. Furthermore, the United States had signed the loan agreements with the King of France, not the Republic. Hamilton, who hated the French Revolution, argued that since the king was dead, the treaties were void. He argued that the United States owed the money to the French monarchy, which no longer existed. It was a convenient legal fiction to avoid paying. Thomas Jefferson, who loved the French Revolution, argued that the debt was owed to the French nation regardless of the government. The debate tore the American cabinet apart. In the end, the United States eventually agreed to resume payments, but they did it slowly, and they refused to join France in its war against Britain. The French felt betrayed. They had bankrupted themselves to free America, and now America was standing on the sidelines, while France was attacked by all of Europe. The tension over the debt and the neutrality eventually led to a quasi-war between the United States and France in 1798, where American and French ships fought each other in the Caribbean. It was the final bitter irony. The two nations that had been forged in the same fire of liberty were now shooting at each other over the bill for that liberty. As we look back at the French Revolution, we must look past the slogans and the symbols. We must look at the ledger. The French Revolution was not inevitable. If Louis XVI had not decided to intervene in the American Revolution, the French budget might have remained manageable. He might have been able to muddle through with gradual reforms. There would have been no massive deficit, no need to call the Estates General, no political crisis, and no guillotine. The American Revolution was the butterfly effect that caused the hurricane in Paris. The 300 million livres that bought the guns for the Battle of Saratoga became the deficit that brought down the French monarchy. The French soldiers who learned about liberty in Virginia brought those ideas home to overthrow their own masters. It is a lesson in the interconnectedness of history. We often think of nations as islands with their own separate stories, but the story of the late 18th century is a single story of a financial Atlantic. Money borrowed in Amsterdam was spent in Philadelphia, creating a deficit in Versailles that led to a revolution in Paris. King Louis XVI is often remembered as a weak and foolish man, but in a strange way, he is one of the founding fathers of the United States. He gave the money, the ships, and the soldiers that made American independence possible. He sacrificed his treasury, and ultimately his life, for a cause that he did not fully understand. The stars and stripes fly today because the lilies of France withered. The next time you see a picture of the storming of the Bastille, remember that the anger of that crowd was fueled by a financial crisis that was born in the 13 colonies. Remember that the price of liberty is often paid by someone else. And remember that in the game of empires, debt is the most dangerous weapon of all. The French monarchy did not die on the guillotine. It died in the account books of the American War. The blade was just the final punctuation mark on a sentence that had been written in red ink years before. Subscribe now to stay ahead of the curve, because when the history books are written, you'll want to be among the few who saw it.